Welcome to the Archetypal Mosaic. This is Mikhail. Today I'm interviewing Barry Hoffman, owner of the Gauntlet Press, who is both an author and a publisher. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Gauntlet Press's website is simply that, gauntletpress.com. Barry, you started off as an author yourself. What made you want to write, and how did you become a publisher?
What made me want to write? I just had a passion for reading, and in the 70s I began dabbling in writing, mainly for the students that I was teaching. I was a 5th, 6th, sometimes 7th and 8th grade teacher, and I would write short stories about the kids in my class, and they seemed, to enjoy it. They seemed to be able to learn how to read better when they were reading about themselves or stories that dealt with their classmates. So that's how I began writing, and I went from there to writing short stories on other topics, and then at some point decided I would write a novel.
Now, you've written 5 novels at this point, correct?
Actually, I've had 13 novels published, and I've got a good 5 or 6 that are not yet published.
Great. And they're all available on your website?
They're available on both GauntletPress.com. They're also available. I've got a website. It's the Gauntlet website, and then they're available from Amazon.com.
Now, before we start talking about your collaborations with some incredibly famous and respected authors, Gauntlet are the armored gloves for knights, etc. How did you come up with that? What's the image about?
Well, before I began publishing books, I published a magazine dealing with censorship, and basically I asked different people for suggestions for a title, and my father suggested Gauntlet, fighting through the adversity. I published Gauntlet magazine for about 10 years, and then I also started publishing books about a year or so after the first issue of the magazine. It became a little bit too much of a gruel to do both, and with the changing market, the magazine ended up, bleeding red. When I started, I think I had anywhere from 12 to 20 distributors, including Diamond Comics and other comic distributors, and basically Diamond either destroyed their competition or bought them out, and that occurred with a lot of places. I had a distributor that distributed to Borders, and then the distributor went out of business, and I walked into a store and saw copies of the magazine, still there. So that wasn't a very good experience. So after at some point I decided that I couldn't do both, and I had become more interested in working with authors like Richard Matheson and Ray Bradbury. So we put the magazine to bed after about 23 issues, I believe, and then I ended up spending my time writing and publishing these signed limited editions.
Great. Now let's talk a little bit about working with Bradbury and Mr. King. Now, with Bradbury, I actually went to a Bradbury week back in 2010 to the WGA, and I had a meet and greet with him, and he's such a lovely, fun man. First of all, how was it working with Mr. Bradbury? God bless his soul.
It was wonderful. He's he's a gentleman. He's really humble. I think I work with a number of authors, and Bradbury, Richard Matheson, and Bob Block were all cut from the same cloth. Besides being wonderful writers, they were wonderful people, and I've worked with some difficult authors as well, and I can tell you it's so much more enjoyable working with someone like Ray Bradbury, who I first became introduced to Bradbury when I was a teacher. My students would read his work, and they would write him letters, and he sent back to the class a poster which he signed. He was someone like the other two gentlemen I mentioned, who until the later years in his life, he didn't have a secretary. He didn't have an assistant. He would get a mail, and he would, read it himself, respond himself. This is the kind of person he was. Everything he did, he did on his own, and it shows the kind of character he had. And at some point, I asked him if I could publish The October Country as a signed limited edition, and he said yes, and that began a long collaboration of probably close to 20 years.
If you were to describe to the listeners Ray Bradbury in terms of his characteristics of his personality, what would be your top 3 or 5 adjectives or explanations?
Oh, geez. Well, I'd say humble would be one. Incredibly creative would be another. He was a really loquacious, kind of person. He would have discussions with you, but you could sit there with him for hours, and he could regale you with stories both of his life and everything else, under the sun. He could be stubborn. There are certain. It took me a good 5 to 6 years before I was able to convince him to let me publish Dark Carnival. But it was not a mean kind of stubbornness. It was just, if he said no, normally, you didn't go back and ask him again, because the answer would continue, to be no. Dark Carnival was the one exception.
Perfect leadway, because Dark Carnival is really kind of a major focus point of this interview. Dark Carnival is a 1947 collection of short stories by Mr. Bradbury, which originally had 27 stories, and then some of them were re-edited and republished in the October book. 4 of those stories have not been republished until you came along, and those were they're called The Night Set, The Maiden, Reunion, and Interim. Those were kind of left away. The original first edition goes for at least $1,000. So your copy, which came about later on, you mentioned it took quite a while to have him approve it, plus you added some stories that haven't been published to your edition. Can you describe those years? Have you met him? Did you have coffee with him? What was it like to proceed with getting Dark Carnival republished? What's the whole story? And how did you...
Well, the first part of the story is the person who helped me the most in convincing Bradbury to allow us to do it, who is Don Albright, who is Bradbury's bibliographer. What Don would do is several times a year, he lived on the East Coast, several times a year he'd go out to California to Bradbury's home, and he would literally take everything that Bradbury wrote that he ended up not using, and he brought them back with him, and he has a home in another home in Indiana where The only thing there is everything Bradbury. And over the course of the years, there were a number of books that we published that we could only have done because Don had saved little bits and pieces that Bradbury wrote before he went on to something else. Just to give you an example, it took Bradbury 50 years to write Somewhere a Band is Playing, which I believe is his last published novel before he passed away. And he would write a bit of it, and then he'd put it away. Years later, he'd write some more, put it away, do the same thing over and over and over, and then 50 years later, he finally had what he wanted. As a result, there were a lot of passages. Some of them is as short as a paragraph, some as long as 2 or 3 pages that he typed and basically, was going to would have tossed away, except he knew that his bibliographer was going to be coming to get them, and he would just keep them all in a pile, and Don would come and take them with him. And we ended up doing a number of books. We did a book, Masks, which he never finished. But he wrote a beginning, he wrote a middle, he wrote an end, and Don Albright was able to put it together so you had a cohesive story, and Ray agreed to allow us to publish it. So this was done with his consent. Now, with Dark Carnival, I had been speaking with Don about it. He spoke with Ray, and the reason he did not want the book published initially is because, as you mentioned, he rewrote a number of the stories from Dark Carnival and published them in his first mass market book, The October Country. And he felt that the best stories that from Dark Carnival appeared in The October Country, and he didn't particularly like the other ones, which was not actually true. Because later, as we went through this process, there were other friends of his, like William Nolan, Richard Matheson, and they would, talk with him, and they would say, do you like this story? And he goes, yes, I do like that story. Do you like this story? Yes, I do like that story. And on and on. There were a number of stories in Dark Carnival, which didn't appear in the October Country, that he really liked. The other thing, which you alluded to, were the stories that did not appear in the original Dark Carnival. And the reason for that is that the publisher, Arkham House, said they didn't have room for those stories. So they didn't include them, and as I said before, Don Albright had everything that was not included in all of Ray Bradbury's projects, and we were able to get Ray's permission to publish them in our version of Dark Carnival. So we went on and on. At one point, I asked him, I said, look, if we're going to publish the book, this was like in 1997, 1998, if we're going to publish the book, would it be appropriate to do it in 2000? And he said, no, I think 2001 would be the best year. At that point, we had our foot, in the door. We didn't have a yes from him. It would take another couple of years. And what Don Albright eventually suggested is Ray Bradbury was an accomplished painter as well as a wonderful author, and he had a lot of these oil paintings that are just really beautiful. And what Don suggested to Ray is that if we publish the book, we use one of his oil paintings, and that seemed to have been the last hurdle that we had to overcome. He really liked that idea. his only request, which was not a problem for us, is that the title of the book not appear on the front cover or back cover, just his oil painting, and the title would appear on the spine. And since we normally don't sell books in bookstores because they're signed limited editions and they're expensive, we just said, of course, if you don't want the wording on the cover, you got it. And at that point, he finally said, okay, we'll do one printing, and then it goes back in the vault.
Is the reason for the fact that he didn't want the title on the cover because he didn't want it to mess up the image, or because he doesn't really like the title or doesn't feel comfortable with it?
No, he loved the image.
Okay.
It was solely, people could see the entire image without anything obscuring it.
It's interesting because what I've heard from people, and I've read Interim, which is a tiny short story, which would fit into anything, I think, is because some of those stories that haven't ended up anywhere except, thankfully, your edition, is the fact that a lot of them are actually darker and really terrorizing in a way, as opposed to more fun or more light. Have you guys ever had the discussion between the original darkness and kind of like the re-edited lightness?
We didn't have a particular discussion, but during the course of his life, as Bradbury became more successful, personally, I think his writing became less dark. As a result, he didn't dislike those early stories. He just, felt more comfortable with stories that had, a more positive message, later on, in his life. I think, he started out, writing a lot of really, wonderful dark stories, and life has an interesting way of dealing with people. Sometimes you've got people who can have a wonderful life and still write about dark issues, and then you have others who once their life changes, they get married, they have kids, they're better off than they had been. That darkness that had propelled them as authors is no longer there. So I think a lot of the material that he wrote later in life was not near as dark as his early material because of his life experiences.
And that brings me to another point, which is being a performance artist myself and an author as well. I noticed, as do all real artists, that whatever you put out there in the universe in terms of whatever you create, it becomes reality to you in one way or another. You basically have to pay for it. Whatever you create, you pay for, whether it's positive or negative. So I'm wondering, if he experienced that, and if that was one of the reasons why he re-edited some of the stories for the October Country and why he removed others. Do you by any chance know? Has he ever discussed that when he was alive?
I think the reason he rewrote stories is that I think he felt that he actually said it a number of times. He didn't think that the stories in Dark Carnival were written as well as they could have been. Remember, this was his first short story collection, so he was a real novice as far as a published author is concerned, and I think for his first mass market book, the October Country, he felt a need to polish the stories that had first appeared in Dark Carnival up a bit, and that's the reason that he rewrote it. He didn't write the stories to change the tone, because the October Country wasn't released 20 or 30 years after Dark Carnival. It was his first mass market collection. So it had less to do with a change in tone than than wanting to have published the best work possible. And as I said, he tinkered with things all the time. I mean, when you the one I told you that was never published is called Masks, and he had all kinds of tangents where he went left and right and this and that. When you talk about Fahrenheit 451, we published a book called Match the Flame. He wrote a good 20 stories dealing with censorship well before he tackled Fahrenheit 451. And he finally wrote, after a number of short stories and fits and starts, he wrote a novella called The Fireman. And after that, he finally had what he felt he needed, and he went from The Fireman, which was a novella, to Fahrenheit 451, which was a novel. So I think he was always tinkering with ideas, and this whole idea of censorship, he didn't write in one fell swoop. He wrote a number of stories. He wrote story fragments. He wrote novella fragments. And some of them, except for what we did, were never published anywhere else. And but they could have been, because they were really well written. So he was a tinkerer, and as opposed to Richard Matheson, who once he finished something, or felt that he couldn't finish something, he never went back to it, ever.
Mm-hmm. There's definitely something to say for raw talent. When you begin, you're unencumbered. There's nothing blocking you. Just release it and let it go. In your Gauntlet Press version of the Dark Carnival, which, by the way, is still available through the website in its very limited editions as of this recording, has several, not only the unedited, original, full 27 stories, but also some unpublished stories from that period. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, how did you guys choose which of the unpublished stories, and were they all from the same exact time period?
Yeah, they were from the same time period, and they were chosen first. Don Albright would make a number of selections, and then when he went out to the West Coast, he would show them to Ray, and Ray would pick and choose the ones he wanted.
Now,
so it was a real collaborative, effort. While I met with Ray and talked with Ray on the phone, a lot. Don was, someone who, was a constant in Ray's life for, I really can't tell you how many years. For, it's got to be for probably 40 or 50 years. And the two of them could sit down and look at a variety of stories, and Ray would say, all right, that one I like, this one I like, this one, let's put that one aside, and they would sit down and decide. The same with Ray was not as picky when it came to the different fragments that we used in some of the books, like Masks. With those, Don would assemble everything, and then Ray would read it, and approve it. And he very seldom, asked for, any kind of changes. One thing that we did, I asked Ray once, is because he was an artist, I asked him if he would do an original cover for us. And this was our second book we did with him, The Illustrated Man. And he did a pen and ink drawing, and he faxed it to me with a little message at the top saying, "Is this okay?" Which I've noticed from a number of these wonderful writers. There's a little bit of insecurity, and like, I'm going to tell Ray Bradbury that his work is not acceptable. It was wonderful, drawing, and we used it for the cover of the Illustrated Man. And then after that, a bunch of other publishers came to him, and he wrote to me one time, and he told me that yours is going to be the only cover. I'm retiring my pen and paper as far as doing covers is concerned.
That's very fascinating. Do you also have a plethora of additional Ray Bradbury stories that haven't been published that perhaps you will in the future?
Well, I mean, I know that there are Ray Bradbury stories that have never been published. The problem is with Ray having passed, you have to have his estate approve any kind of projects, with Ray's work, and he had a mass market publisher who was very, very selective. I don't agree with her. They would send, for every collection that he wrote, they used about 16 to 20 stories. And Ray would send at least 30, sometimes 40 stories. And the editor at his mass market publisher would reject, half of them, and then publish the other half. And some of them, he submitted 3, 4, or 5 times, and I've read some of those stories, and they're wonderful stories. And they were rejected, and probably now will never appear because they're they're controlled by the estate, and so far the estate has not been willing to publish anything that is previously unpublished. Now, to give you an example of one of the stories, we are publishing probably around February a book called Brothers in Arms, which is a companion anthology to Richard Matheson's Beardless Warriors. And Don Albright had found a story that Ray had written previously unpublished that dealt with war, which is what the Beardless Warriors is about. The Beardless Warriors is a novel that deals with a war recruit's first months, in combat in World War II. So Ray had written this story about a soldier who is going to be deployed the next day and spends a day at the beach with his girlfriend, and it's a wonderful story. It's got a very haunting ending. It's well written. It's not all that long, and I can't give you any reason why a mass market publisher wouldn't have jumped at that story, years and years before we ended up getting approval. What we did is Ray had passed by then. We contacted his agent, and his agent, he contacted the estate, and they gave us permission to publish the story. So if that story's out there, there's got to be many, many other wonderful Bradbury stories, which unfortunately may never get see publication.
Well, I certainly hope they do through you.
Well, it's not for lack of trying, I'll tell you that.
Now, along with Mr. Bradbury, you also have worked with, and you have upcoming books. Depending on when you hear this interview, please check the Gauntlet website to see if they're upcoming or already have been released, including authors Clive Barker, Neil Gaiman, Paul Schrader. Now, what was the collaboration like with Neil, with Clive, and with Mr. King? Because I've actually directed 3 official Dollar Babies, and it's been a pleasure working with Mr. King's assistant. But what's it been like for you collaborating with Neil, Clive, and Mr. King?
Okay, Well, with Clive, I had a really great experience. We published several books of his. Again, these are with Clive. They're signed limited editions, and fortunately, he had someone like Don Albright, Phil and Sarah Stokes, and Clive is like Bradbury is also an artist, and he does a lot of doodles and rough drawings, and he just sends them to Phil and Sarah Stokes. Any that he doesn't use in the mass market edition of the book. So we're able to add a lot of bonus material to anything that we do with Clive. We've got he writes his novels in longhand, and then and we've got pages of that in the book with handwritten corrections. Then he types it up and he makes corrections on the typed version, and we've got that as well. Plus these black and white drawings that he often does for the book, whether they get published with the book or not. And my experience with him was always wonderful. He was very gracious. When in the early I guess the mid '90s, I visited his home, and he actually had two homes, one that he lived in and one that had only his art. And room after room after room was filled, with art, on the walls. And it was just, he took us around and showed us the art and explained. I don't know if you're aware of the Abarat series that he began. I think he's written 3 of the books so far, and Disney purchased them, and Disney was considering, they haven't done it yet, to make a film. And he showed us all of these paintings, and he based the novel on the paintings that he did. So he's a wonderfully creative person, a really nice person to deal with, very down to earth. With King, I've had less contact with him, mainly because he's so busy that you spend most of your time dealing with his assistant Marcia, which is probably the person you spoke to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So most of what
Margaret, actually.
Excuse me?
Margaret is who I've been.
Okay, I think Marco was there before Marcia. Marcia's there now. But one of the things that was really interesting is we did a book of stories in tribute to Richard Matheson, and we already had Joe Hill, one of King's sons, agree to take part in it, and we approached King, about taking part as well. And he said, well, what I'd rather do is write a collaboration, with my son. And, of course, I said yes. That was even, better than having a story by King himself, because it was the first collaboration between the two. And that appeared in He Is Legend, which is, again, stories, in tribute to Richard Matheson. And we still have, those are still available. Mm-hmm. And as far as Neil Gaiman is concerned, we worked in collaboration with Borderlands Press on certain books. And one of the books was Nothing O'Clock by Neil Gaiman, which was a Doctor Who story he wrote. And Tom Montleone at Borderlands Press is friendly with Neil. So in that case, I did not work with Neil. Tom worked with Neil, and the two presses published the book together.
And then also Taxi Driver, which cover art, by the way, the cover art for that is absolutely spectacular. And I have to say the Clive Barker book, Emerville, that's his painting with a little iguana lion on his head. It's really, really amazing.
Yeah, what I found really interesting is there are publishers who publish a Clive Barker book without Clive Barker art, cover art, and I find that really ridiculous. I mean, Clive has got so much art. And he's such a wonderfully talented artist that if you're doing a book, by Clive Barker, especially in the small press, I can see mass market publishers. They have their own set of rules, and many authors, don't like the cover art that they get from a mass market publisher. What Gauntlet's philosophy is we get approval from the author on everything that we do, especially the cover art. When we published Bob Block's Psycho, the only thing he was interested in having approval on was the art, and he wanted art that had nothing to do with the movie, because there were too many paperback versions of Psycho that dealt with the movie. So we put him in touch with an artist, and the artist came up with a rough sketch, and he loved it. The same thing with Bradbury. When we could, we would use his art or the art of Joe Magnani, who did the original art for some of the novels and stories that Bradbury wrote. So we've spent a lot of time making sure that the art for every book is approved by the artist, by the author.
Now, where are the books actually printed?
We've had a number of printers. I mean, I've been in business now. This is about 22, 23 years. So we go to we've had a variety of printers, and it's some printers, there's turnover, and the quality of work may suffer, so we go somewhere else. So we've found just a number of printers that we've used over the years.
Now, when you have like the script of Taxi Driver, which is signed by Robert De Niro, Martin Scorsese, and the author, how do you get them all to sign it? Do you send the same page around in a FedEx envelope, or?
Yes, because some people are not aware of how it works. You can't, we can't print up 500 copies of a book, send those 500 copies to the author, and then ask the author, or in some cases in an anthology, you may have 20 authors. You can't ask them then to sign it. It just is a physical, impossibility, and you can just also imagine the damage that would occur, with books shipping back and forth, from author to author to author. So what you have is called a tip sheet, and the tip sheet is just you print up for 500 copies. You print up 500 of the same page. It usually has some kind of image on it. You send it to the author, and the author then signs it. Now with Bradbury, it became very interesting because he would just pile everything that would arrive, in these piles in his where he worked, and he would get around to it when he could get around to it. So my son was living in LA, and what he would do as Ray got on in years, and he would go over to Ray's house with tip sheets, and he would Ray would sign, my son would turn the page. He would keep signing. While he's doing this, he's telling my son, various stories dealing with his life, with movies he's seen, and things like that. And then when Ray got tired, he would just say, "Okay, that's it for today." And my son would say, "Fine." he would, take the tip sheets that were completed, leave, and then a couple of weeks later would call back up. So these are just individual, pieces of paper. They end up being bound in the book. When we send the book to the printer, we send the tip sheets along with it, and they're all, printed and bound together.
But in a thing like the Taxi Driver script, when you have three major personalities, Robert De Niro, Martin Scorsese, the author of the script, how do they? Did this keep traveling around the 500 pages? Did it start with Martin to go to Robert? How did that go?
No, in this case, it depends on the book. In this case, we sent a separate tip sheet for Martin Scorsese and for De Niro, and then Schrader had his own tip sheet. It would be the same thing with King. If I had a book where there were 20 authors and one of them was King, I wouldn't send have his tip sheet as part of the rest of them, because if they get lost or damaged, you really can't call up Stephen King's secretary and say, could you do me a favor and sign the tip sheets over again? We had a problem. So for certain books, we send a separate tip sheet that the author signs, and only that particular author is on that tip sheet. Yeah. So we may have in Taxi Driver, we had three separate tip sheets.
Now, do you also
and on the cover art, just you're going to get back to that question that you had, with Schrader, we had one idea that we gave to him, and he wasn't thrilled with it. So he spoke to the artist, and he said he wanted something with a Chinese feel, and he explained to the artist that we used what he wanted, and the final version that you see now is the version that Schrader approved of. He liked that a lot.
I love it a lot too. Now, do you send extra tip sheets? For example, if a pen smudges, or if somebody has, the signature kind of goes off, did you send like 10 extras or anything like that?
Yeah, we always send extras. We also send extras for spoilage. Sometimes when you send the tip sheets to the printer, some will get damaged just as a matter of course when they're doing the binding. So we'll send about 50 extra tip sheets, because we want to make sure we have the 500 to sell. We also give the author 20 copies of the book, and we give the artist and other people who have been involved in the book a copy. With Taxi Driver, we sent De Niro, Scorsese each a copy of the lettered edition of the book, and then we sent Schrader 20 copies. That's what we always do with the author. And if they want additional copies, we give them a discount on any additional copies besides the 3 copies they get.
And then when a book is numbered and signed, is it signed or numbered first?
It's signed first, because it's just like you said. If the author smudges number, if we had numbered them first and he smudges number 48, we might not. He's not going to necessarily, let us know. He just goes on and keeps on signing them. So what we do is we have the tip sheets signed first, and then we number them when they're returned to us.
Now, on your website, it says PayPal is not accepted for lettered editions, credit cards only. Can you share why?
I've had problems with PayPal. I'd rather not go into what they are.
Okay.
I find PayPal is not very business, friendly when there's a problem. And so, when it comes to the bigger priced items, I've had a couple of problems, with them. and I've decided that for an item that's going to cost a couple of $100, we're going to just accept credit cards as opposed to PayPal.
Now, when you have to deal with, because genius can be difficult. I know some genius people who are difficult, and I think that's okay. How do you deal with difficult people, difficult authors and agents?
Well, for the most part, I try to steer clear of them, to be perfectly honest. I don't make a fortune, from Gauntlet. It's a labor of love for me. When I publish, something that was previously unpublished by Ray Bradbury, the feeling I get is that I'm enhancing his legacy. That there are people 50 years from now are going to be reading Masks, which would never have been published by a mass market publisher because it was never finished. There are other books that we've published by Ray that have material in it that would never see the light of day. In October Country, we have the way that Ray worked with Joe Mugnani is Ray would draw a rough drawing of what he was interested in the art to look like. This is for interior art, and Mugnani would then send him a rough drawing of what his interpretation would be. And once he got Ray's approval, then he would do the final, piece of art. Now, some of these appear in the October Country. They would never have appeared in any other version of the book than ours. So, I feel that I'm with people like with Ray Bradbury and some of these other authors, that I'm helping to enhance their legacy by printing material that would never see the light of day. With Richard Matheson, we published his very first novel, which was a mainstream novel that his agent told him was too long for a first novel and would never have been published. So he put it away, unlike Bradbury, who would have tinkered with it. And we ended up publishing it, and otherwise it would have never been published. So, I work with people that I can deal with. Now, I have worked with some people who, they're not necessarily difficult, they're just less helpful. There are some people who, when you ask for bonus, material, they'll give you a ton. David Morrell for, First Blood, the first book in the Rambo series, he had a ton of material, and he kept finding more, and he kept sending it to us, and it turned out to be really wonderful. Well, there are other authors that you speak with, and they tell you basically, I've got nothing more to offer, or they don't want to offer, and you just have to accept that, and then do the best you can. And I'm not going to mention any names. I'm not going to badmouth anybody in an interview. That's not the way I roll. But I have dealt with people who are very, very difficult. A couple of people, not many. Most of the people I've dealt with are wonderful, but I have dealt with one or two, people who, if I told you in private who they were, you probably would know that they were difficult to deal with.
Just a few more questions before we wrap up the interview. In terms of the pages, when I, for example, go into an antique bookshop, I see, if I want to get a book from 200 years ago, it's brown, there's acid, there's brown spots and all that stuff. The way books are printed now, do you think they'll last longer? Are they made in a different way?
Yeah, well, our books and many small publishers, like us, we print on acid-free paper, so they're not going to turn brown. Okay. Mass market publishers, they're going to use the cheapest paper they can. So if you buy, a new Stephen King book, that book is from a mass market publisher, the pages are going to turn brown. If you buy a book, a signed limited edition from a specialty press, they're going to use acid-free paper, and they'll never turn brown.
But for all the Stephen King readers, keep on buying all his books because he's amazing. We just want to say that. Now, Richard Matheson, The Secrets of the Twilight Zone. Has he ever, during your meetings and stuff, has he ever shared anything with you that you can share about the Twilight Zone, which is unique and unheard of?
Well, the thing that was most interesting with the Twilight Zone is that, for the most part, Rod Serling, he wrote 93 scripts, which we ended up publishing as a signed limited edition, signed by Carol Serling. After years and years of her saying no, we kept on, nicely badgering her, and she finally said yes. But what Serling did, which was to his credit, is he hired. He didn't necessarily hire. He had a couple of authors who he resonated with, that he worked with, a lot. One was Matheson. Matheson wrote the most stories, adapted they're mainly adaptations of his short stories, and he was also a screenplay writer, as was Bradbury. And Matheson wrote about 20 to 25 screenplays that appeared on the Twilight Zone, including one that's the most famous, Nightmare at 20,000 Feet. If you read, magazine articles dealing with Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, very seldom is Matheson credited with writing the screenplay. He was one. Charles Beaumont, the late Charles Beaumont, was another. He wrote probably about 20 as well. And then there were several authors. George Clayton Johnson wrote a couple. Earl Hamner wrote a couple. There were a couple of Bradburys that were adapted. So, and what they did is Matheson would write his script, and Serling would film it as written. He unlike now in Hollywood, where a script goes through 12 rewrites, Serling, wrote, produced what the author, gave him. And, it was a credit, to Serling, and also, a credit, to Matheson and Beaumont and these other authors that, what they wrote, was filmed exactly as they wrote it.
Now, let me ask you this kind of almost final question. In Fahrenheit 451, which...
In what?
In Fahrenheit 451 by Bradbury.
Yeah.
Whether it's considered a classic or it definitely will be a classic or it's somewhere in between right now. First of all, do you think it's currently a classic? And the most important question is, do you think that in the future, what happens in that book could actually happen in real life?
Okay, first of all, I'm certain that's the classic right now. And it will be 50, 100 years from now, it'll still be, considered a classic. The other thing is that, could it happen? Of course. One thing to reread is his, I'm not sure if it's an introduction or an afterword. I believe it's an afterword. What we did is a good 40 years after he wrote the book and wrote the afterward, we republished the afterward in Gauntlet magazine. And if you read that afterward, 40 years after he wrote it, it was still as relevant in the year 1990 as it was in 1950 when he first wrote it. And if you read it again today, it's just as relevant. So I fervently believe that what he says, can, could, and is happening. You got book burnings all over the world, and including this country. You got recently, I forget where it was, you had some LGBT books that were from a library that were burned, and the library is not certain if they're going to replace the books. This is, a problem that, is a never-ending one, where, people who don't like certain things are going to destroy it, or do their best to destroy it. And I don't, things may not occur, as they did in Fahrenheit 451, but there is every possibility that censorship, will continue, book burnings, will continue and possibly grow.
Well, we definitely hope not. But it's interesting to get this response. Do you know why 451 as opposed to 450 or 449?
That's the temperature that paper will burn at.
451, not below or
Yep.
after. Okay. Well, do you have anything else that you'd like to share with the audience, either about your publishing house, your website, your own books, anything at all?
I say only that a book of mine that is going to be coming out shortly, called Tracks of My Tears, basically deals with. I think, are you aware of the Baylor scandal, where there was a cover-up of football players who date raped female co-eds on campus, and they were covered up?
No, I'm not familiar with this.
Okay, well, that was a major scandal, and I decided to write a book of what could occur there, on steroids. I think it's an important book. It deals with the victimization and exploitation of young women, but also the empowerment of women who take back their lives, after what occurred on a campus.
Wow. And when will that be available?
That should be available January, February.
And that's a book by you, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Well, it's been a true pleasure speaking with you, Mr. Hoffman, about Gauntlet Press and all of the incredible publishing work you do with some of the most brilliant authors ever. And please visit gauntletpress.com to get some books and to learn more about this conversation.
I have one last thing I can add, a little teaser, because I can't give the all the information. But those who are interested in Stephen King, we've got a couple of projects that one we've signed a contract, another we are close to, and one may appear next year, and the other would appear the year after. Go to our website or subscribe to our newsletter. When we have 500 copies of anything from Stephen King, they sell quickly, and it's something that I think anybody interested in Stephen King will look forward to.
And do you think, I know I asked you this before, but do you think there'll be any more publications from Ray Bradbury?
I think there will be. Next year is his 100th birthday, and I know that his agent is working on with the estate on some projects. I don't know what they are. I don't know if it's new material or if it's going to be previously released material in some unique way. We have a proposal in with his agent, and we already have some commitments which are truly unique. Just to give you an example, when we published Matheson's Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, we got William Shatner to write a short piece and sign tip sheets for the lettered edition of that. And we've got plans along similar lines. Once we get this one project okayed by the state. So basically, I'm sure there's going to be material coming out for his 100th anniversary of his birthday. But everybody at his agency and his estate has been very closed-mouthed about it so far, and I don't know what it is, but I think that there will be material.
Great. Well, it's been a pleasure speaking with Barry Hoffman for Gauntlet Press. Enjoy, and then check out the website. Have a great day.